I think that earworm that he incorporated early in his administration, the first time around, and actually during his campaign, this moniker of fake news
Yeah,
was so corrosive to media because it instilled this lack of trustworthiness and this dismissiveness of anything that was reported about Donald Trump that was negative. But it was
correct.
incredibly effective, wasn't it?
It really hurt our democracy tremendously. I really think that was one of the biggest catalysts to kind of where we are today, because when you can't trust the news, when you can't trust what you're reading or what you're watching anymore, or even if you do trust it, but there is just a little birdie in the back of your head that says, huh, maybe this isn't fully right or fully accurate because Donald Trump says it's not.
Hi, everyone. Well, if you're not already, you may soon become one of the nearly 6 million followers of Aaron Parnes. He is a viral news aggregator, his words, in the Substack / TikTok universe. And by the way, I have just joined the Substack universe as well, so maybe you'll check it out. Aaron's goal is to take on legacy media, which I find a little offensive, although I don't think I'm that anymore. But the question is how? And what exactly does he mean by that? Aaron Parnes, I'm so excited to talk to you. How are you?
I'm doing good. Super excited for this conversation. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about yourself, Aaron. Pretend like we're having coffee. We've never met before. Tell me your story, and because you're a brainiac, and you have been since you were very young, right?
I mean, I've had a very unique kind of upbringing. I My story really starts actually back when I was 12 years old. At the time, I did wanted to be a lawyer, and I didn't know what being a lawyer really meant. So my dad actually sat me down in front of the TV and told me to watch at the time the Casey Anthony trial, which was blowing up all over Florida.
Oh,
And
really lovely, lovely content for a 12-year-old, by the
you
way.
would think, right? I mean, I grew up in a Ukrainian household, so parenting that's parenting. So anyway, he sat me down and he was like, just watch opening statements and you may like this. I ended up sitting myself for 31 days watching start to finish the entire trial and kind of fell in love with the way the attorneys moved around the courtroom and advocated for either side. And that moment there made me want to go to law school and made me want to go in an expedited fashion. So
Yes, I'll say expedited. You went to college at 14, right? This is, by the way, growing up in Boca Raton, Florida. Did you have
right.
siblings, by the way?
I have six
Oh
siblings.
my God.
I know. Yes. I am the oldest. I have younger siblings who I love and I'm very close to. But yeah, grew up in Boca Raton. Started college when I was 14 in this like dual enrollment hybrid program.
Wait,
Graduated.
where was that, by the way?
It's called Florida Atlantic University
Oh
High
yeah,
School.
I've heard of that because I used to live in Miami.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. So it's about 100 kids do it a year. We, instead of taking high school classes, you take college classes with college students, and it kind of counts for both high school and college credit. And so I kind of overloaded, graduated with my BA when I was 18, actually a week before technically graduating high school. And I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer and wanted to go to law school. And so I went straight to George Washington University in Washington, D.C., graduated 3 years later, and then quit practicing law a few years after that.
Well,
So
let's talk about that pivot
yeah,
for you professionally. Why did you decide after watching the Casey Anthony trial for 31 days and graduating from GW Law School at right at the tender age of 21? What changed your mind? Why did you decide suddenly I don't really want to be a lawyer?
well, so I realized that being a lawyer wasn't necessarily being in a courtroom every day. I think everyone on TV really makes it like this glamorous lifestyle where you're fighting on these big issues and you're in front of the Supreme Court or you're in front of a jury every day. And yeah, I had my fair share of time in court, but it wasn't an everyday kind of experience. I mean, my dream truly was to be a public defender for the rest of my life and just do that. But public defenders, unfortunately, in our country just don't make a livable wage in many areas. And I believe at the time in Miami, public defenders were making about $36,000 a year to start. And in Miami, you can't live off of that. You just truly can't. So I had to go, and I had massive student debt. So I had to go into private practice, and it just wasn't the lifestyle that I wanted to live. And so it wasn't necessarily that I didn't want to be a lawyer. It's just that I found a different avenue to advocate for the issues and the people that I believe in.
And
So
I was going to say, Aaron, sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say you really had this, I guess, dramatic or significant life change.
yeah.
Let's go back to 2016. You're volunteering for the Trump campaign back then. As how old were you then? My math is not good, Aaron.
About 16, 17 years old.
So what appealed to you about Donald Trump at the time?
So I think it was just different. And I tell everyone, my first experience, my first foray into politics was Donald Trump, just like many people my age. I don't remember the Obama years. I don't remember the Bush years. I remember the 2015, 2016 election cycle. And during that election cycle, I really knew nothing different other than Donald Trump. My dad had known him in the past, being in the same circles in Miami. And I believe he actually worked for Donald Trump's dad in New York as one of his first jobs. And so what appealed to me was that he was just a different kind of beast in this political realm. And he just kind of told it like it was. And he was just interesting. And so I personally, I volunteered very kind of haphazardly. Like I was still in school and like really wasn't doing much for the campaign, if anything at all, maybe knocked a door or two. But ultimately, didn't really realize what it was like or what it meant to be a quote unquote Trump supporter or even a Republican until
Really?
I grew up. Yeah, so I always identified at the time, I was like, yeah, I'm a Republican, but I didn't know what Republicans stood for.
But as such a
I
smart kid, I'm surprised that you sort of blindly followed him because he was different or charismatic or unfiltered. That just doesn't sound like the Aaron Parnes I've come to know in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. But when you grow up in a house and all that's on is Fox News, and that's all you're watching, and that's all you're kind of absorbing, and then when you're talking in family discussions, all you're absorbing is Donald Trump, and when you're with family friends, all you're absorbing is Donald Trump. You don't know any better. And I never really had, and something about me that people have come to realize is that I'm a very stubborn person. So when people kind of pushed back on me in college, when my friends were like, "Hey, what are you doing? What are you thinking?" Every time they did that, I kind of dug my heels in further, as just being stubborn myself. So it really was a fault of mine, for not really kind of doing my own research and understanding really what was happening. And at the time, I mean, when you think about it, when you look back at the 2016 campaign and you look from start to finish Donald Trump's campaign, I don't know that you can really tell me a policy proposal or two that he really had. He just kind of threw out these big ideas that he's going to make America great again and he's going to do all these great things for the country. And that resonated, I guess, with my 16-year-old self. But when I really learned about his policy agenda when he became president, kind of shifted dramatically and quickly.
Yeah. Well, before we talk about that shift, I'm curious, what was it like being involved in the Trump campaign? Adriana, who produced this interview, had an interesting question about sort of the bro culture, I guess the nascent manosphere, if you will, that was starting to bubble up, I think, in 2016. Can you talk about that and what some of your fellow volunteers were like and why they were attracted to Donald Trump?
That was a long time ago. I mean, I like I said, truth be told, I don't really remember much from that time. But B, I wasn't really ingrained in the campaign that much. I think there was one article that was written that I was a volunteer on the campaign, but that just meant like I knocked a few doors.
Yeah, so you weren't really that invested, but you
Not a
liked him and you preferred him to Hillary Clinton. And you say it's really because Fox News was playing 24/7 in your house and your dad, who I'll talk about with you in a moment. But what did you have against Hillary Clinton?
I had nothing against Hillary Clinton. It wasn't an anti-Hillary. It was more of a pro-Trump, right? I had nothing against her. And looking back on it, if my political personal views definitely aligned with hers a lot more. So it was nothing against her at all.
Let's talk about your dad. So, your dad had a huge influence on you. And God, talk about a fascinating backstory. Tell me about him and what happened to him and how it contributed to your political ideological transformation. That sounded very erudite, didn't it?
A little bit, but it makes sense. I mean, so my dad wasn't really ever involved in politics growing up. I remember the first time we ever went to a political event was the 2012 election night party, and my dad and my family wore like red for a Republican for Mitt Romney, and you had to wear the colors of either red or blue. I ended up choosing to wear orange because I didn't want to identify with either side. But other than that, we didn't really do politics at all. And it wasn't until Trump announced in 2015, about a month or so later, he had a rally in Doral, Florida. And my dad took me there and was able to, I don't know how, but we got some kind of pass and we met Donald Trump in kind of one of those step and repeat photo lines. And about 100 of us met him. And then we went to the rally, and then I thought that was the end of it. But then Fox News continued to play in the house. Then my dad continued to kind of get closer and closer to the Trump orbit. He became buddy buddy with Rudy Giuliani. He ended up, I believe, co-hosting or helping host some type of fundraiser for Donald Trump after the Access Hollywood tape came out in South Florida, and just became very, very close to the craziness within MAGA. But I don't even to this day know the true extent of it all.
And wasn't he involved in trying to dig up dirt about Hunter Biden in Ukraine?
He was, but that was post Trump's victory. That really whole effort, from what I understand, and like I said, I don't know everything, but from what I understand, that didn't really start happening until 2017, 2018, when he and Rudy became closer. But during the 2016 campaign, I don't think they were discussing that at
But
all.
after they became close, during Trump's first term, there were a lot of illegal shenanigans going on, right, Aaron?
From what I can see, there were a lot of shenanigans going on
I mean,
across the board.
he eventually went to prison, your father, right?
He did, but he went to prison. It was unrelated to anything related to the Rudy Hunter Biden stuff.
Oh, what did he go to prison for?
So he went to prison for defrauding a number of investors in a personal company that he was running, and then also for he was convicted of funneling about $500,000 from this Russian man into a U.S. super PAC. But that was during the 2016 campaign, I believe. I don't really know the true details of it.
Okay, so this is fascinating to me. Aaron, you're so smart. You've got a law degree. Your dad gets in trouble. He goes to prison, and yet you're kind of fuzzy on the details.
Yeah, because between you and me, I mean, I think anyone who goes through something like that, I mean, I say October 10th, 2019, the day he was arrested, was one of the worst days in my life, because it truly was. It's a time period where I have worked my hardest to kind of black out in a way as a coping
Mm-hmm.
mechanism. It fractured my family, it changed my life completely. And really, we felt the weight of the federal government on our shoulders for several months, over a year, and it was a very difficult time. So yeah, it is very fuzzy, and it's intentionally fuzzy because I don't want to take myself back there if I don't have to.
That's interesting, and I think on a lot of levels very understandable. So, what is your relationship like with your dad today?
We have a good relationship. I mean, like a father and a son. I mean, it's definitely not as close as it used to be. I think we have went through our own trials and tribulations, and um, it's been tough. But at the end of the day, he's my dad, and I love him for being my dad, and that's what I want him to be. Just a regular, plain dad.
And I'm putting a button on this because it sounds like this is not easy to talk about and dredges up a lot of painful memories for you. But how does he feel about Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump and the whole MAGA movement, given what he's been through? Obviously, you said his prison time was not related to that, but I'm sure there was a lot of negative fallout from his political dealings. So, where is he right now in his head about all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think he really felt like they turned their backs on him, right? That he did all this stuff for them. He helped them with the Hunter Biden stuff. He went out of his way and put his neck on the line, put his neck out on the line for them. And then the moment that he got in trouble, they kind of turned their back on him. And I think he really took it personally. He's someone who's very kind of emotional. And so the moment they kind of turned against him, it was, I remember about 12 days after he was arrested, he kind of called and he was like, I'm done. Like, I'm not going back. Like, I'm not letting them drag me back into that world.
So, you witnessed all this. How did it feed into your change of heart
Yeah.
about Donald Trump being kind of cool and different and speaking his mind to Donald Trump might not be so good for the country. And how much was it influenced by what your dad experienced or simply by you becoming a more informed citizen?
Yeah, so it's interesting. A lot of people think that my dad got arrested and I switched parties the day after. That's not how it happened. I actually was in law school at the time in my third year, but over the first 2 years prior, I really started to shift personally. I saw thing I really kind of experienced a political awakening by going through day-to-day life. Like for example, I had a friend who was doing AmeriCorps in Miami when I was a summer associate there, and I went to her school and just saw the disparities between what the children in her school had and what I had growing up. And in that moment I was like, well, one party wants to make sure these kids have equal access to education, the other party doesn't. Right? So I had lived experiences like those, completely unrelated to my dad, that really began to move me away from Donald Trump. And truth be told, being in those circles made me uncomfortable. I just never really fit in to the quote unquote MAGA circles. I never talked like them. I never acted like them. I didn't enjoy being in those rooms. And so while I stood by my dad while he was in those circles and just kind of kept quiet because I wanted to be a lawyer, right? And I didn't really want to be in this political circle. Uh, I began that shift a long time before he was arrested.
Why, and tell me a little bit about being in those circles. What was it that made you uncomfortable, Aaron?
Just seemed like they a lot of people in those circles, number one, what really got me uncomfortable was the language they used. I don't want to say I'm like more proper, but like I don't curse in my day-to-day life. Like I don't demonize women. And a lot of like the older men would do that. And it was very uncomfortable, just very like, I felt like kind of gross sometimes walking out of those rooms. It didn't, everything was very heavy on like drinking or smoking cigars. It was very like broy. I felt like I was in a frat house with people over the age of 50. And that to me just like never vibed. I didn't like it at all.
So you could witness sexism. Did you hear much racism in those circles? I'm just curious.
I mean, I've never heard like blatant racism, but there are plenty of microaggressions. I mean, you can tell the underlying thoughts and beliefs of a number of these people for sure.
Well, you have a fascinating backstory. Thank you for spending some time sharing it with me. And so you decided to not be a lawyer and that you couldn't really earn a living in some of these jobs.
Yeah.
And so, what flipped the switch for you to say, I want to help people understand the world? I want to be a communicator.
Yeah, so it was actually February of 2022. I was about a year and a half out of law school at the time, and Russia invaded Ukraine. And at the time, I had family in Ukraine, in Kiev, on the ground. I had an uncle, a cousin, and an aunt. And I would hear from them what they would be seeing outside of their front window, right? They'd see tanks rolling down the streets, planes overhead. And then I'd watch mainstream media or cable news here in the United States. And I really saw a disparity in the coverage, and mainly in just how fast cable news got the news to us here in the United States. I would hear things from my uncle, and then an hour and a half later, I'd hear it on CNN. And I was like, well, I think there's a vacuum here that could be filled. I think that what cable news is doing isn't necessarily as good of a job as it should be. And so I just pulled out my phone and just started sharing on TikTok what my uncle and my family was sharing with me on the ground. And within about a week, I had 1 million followers who were now interested in what was happening in Ukraine. And didn't they had many of them didn't even know where Ukraine was on a map, but they were interested in what was happening on the ground. And I think in that moment I realized, hey, there's something here. I can do this not just about Ukraine, but I can really start kind of educating folks about other topics as well. And that didn't really happen until later on, but I spent about 6 months every day posting 10 to 15 times about Ukraine and what was happening when Russia was invading.
Did you ever feel any trepidation, Aaron, that as much as your uncle was experiencing something firsthand, as an old school journalist, of course, there are things like, vetting, double
Or
sourcing, making sure what you're sharing with, consumers is accurate. Did you ever feel like, gosh, I may need to understand the situation more than simply my uncle's eyewitness account?
For sure. And I think, especially at the beginning, there were times where I would actually hear something from on the ground. Like, for example, I remember there was a story where President Zelensky was either asked to leave Kiev out of fears for his safety or something like that. It was like a bombshell story. And I heard it because Ukrainian media were kind of talking about it from family. And then I was like, well, I can't necessarily report this. This kind of seems like a crazy story to talk about without any corroboration. An hour later, CNN reported it, and then I reported it. But I think over time, I grew more comfortable in kind of sharing doing my own kind of due diligence and doing my own research and doing my own vetting. And it got to the point where I've kind of established my own kind of set of ethics that I have for anything that I put out. And those are that as a lawyer, I would never lie in a brief to a judge. I would get disbarred. I would never put something out on my social media that could get me disbarred in a courtroom. So it's not necessarily the traditional journalistic ethics, but
Right.
kind of take those legal ethics and really apply them to what I do.
And there's transparency in terms of telling your audience if something hasn't been
Right.
corroborated yet. I mean, you're very honest about that, and so they understand that something may need to be, uh, re-reported or adjusted to events that may
For
occur.
sure.
Right?
Yeah, for sure. And there are definitely times where I get things wrong, and there have been, and there are times where stories have had to be kind of not necessarily edited, but recanted, and I repost and I say, listen, this was wrong, and here's why it was wrong. And I think that all builds to kind of the authenticity of the platform that I built. I'm not afraid to say when I'm wrong, or when a news report that I kind of share ends up being recanted, for example, which has happened a number of times.
Right. Well, let's talk about sort of this transition a little bit more and about legacy media, because I know
Yeah.
you go on a tear about legacy media, and it sometimes hurts my feelings. I'm totally kidding, but I think there's a lot of things wrong with legacy media myself. But I want to ask you about something you wrote on your Substack. You
Or
said, for years, legacy media outlets have painted Donald Trump as a threat to our way of life, but once he won, they changed their tune. Suddenly, he wasn't a danger to democracy anymore. It was as if a switch flipped, and legacy media became concerned about Trump's potential to impact their financial interests. And that's exactly why my platform has seen such rapid growth since the election. All right. So let's take a look at what you said
or
that and investigate it a little bit further. Tell me a little more about what you mean and why you think legacy media has really lost the room, so to speak.
I think legacy media or media generally has started losing the room the moment they started putting money first. And I think it goes back to a long time ago. It's not recent. It's when the Washington Post first went from a free paper to one that you have to pay 10 cents for and then 30 cents for. Now you have to pay several dollars a month for. When you put money above the stories, and you put stories behind a paywall, and you look to your bottom kind of line more than you do to what you're reporting, I think you lose trust in the viewers that you're kind of trying to reach.
But but newspapers have charged for a very long time, Aaron,
Or
and they did maintain the trust of their readers, and broadcast news really maintained the trust of their viewers. I mean, they do have to pay their employees,
for
and
sure.
journalists have to make a living, and they can't necessarily do it through advertising alone. I feel like something more significant and nefarious has happened actually in recent weeks in terms of the trust
Yeah,
factor. So you're saying people news should be free,
I do.
which is a very difficult model. I have to be
It is.
honest,
I
and
agree.
not really tenable.
I tend to agree with you, and I think there needs to be a solution. I mean, my dream is for all news to be free. I realize that that's not necessarily always realistic, but I do take your point in that, especially recently, especially over the past, I guess, since November, but really since 2016, since Trump first ran. I mean, the moment he started attacking the press as the enemy of the people, I really think we have seen kind of a change in the tune of the press. But it really wasn't until, I guess, the past 6 months where he actually went after the press legally that we've really seen a dramatic shift.
Yeah,
And I
let's
think
talk about those two phases, Aaron, because I'm so fascinated by this as well. I think that earworm that he incorporated early in his administration, the first time around, and actually during his campaign, this moniker of fake news,
Yeah,
was so corrosive to media because it instilled this lack of trustworthiness and this dismissiveness of anything that was reported about Donald Trump that was negative. But it was
correct.
incredibly effective, wasn't it?
It was. It was. I mean, it turned a large swath of people away from cable news, away from even reading anymore. And it really hurt our democracy tremendously. I really think that was one of the biggest catalysts to kind of where we are today, because when you can't trust the news, when you can't trust what you're reading or what you're watching anymore, or even if you do trust it, but there is just a little birdie in the back of your head that says, huh, maybe this isn't fully right or fully accurate because Donald Trump says it's not.
And I
That's a
think that's also contributed to the rise of right wing media because
for sure.
he only says the journalists he claims are enemies of the people, or the news that he claims is fake, is only content that is critical of him. So people
Correct.
get an extremely warped perspective. And the way he's taken on journalists and these sort of Oval Office gaggles, whether you're talking about Caitlin Collins and insulting her, Peter Alexander, I couldn't believe how he unleashed on Peter Alexander, who's not only an incredibly nice person, but a really
It's good.
experienced,
Yeah.
intelligent reporter, was just honestly appalling to me. And so I think he has really, instilled this disdain, honestly, for media that is not lauding him or celebrating him. And then, as you mentioned, phase two was a whole new level where he was actually suing these media outlets for quote unquote offenses that most experts say could have been defended in a court of law, starting with ABC News and George Stephanopoulos, and then moving on to other news organizations, and most recently CBS, Paramount, and 60 Minutes. So, talk about that and how you felt as a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. My late husband was a lawyer, so I used to talk to him about all this stuff. But how you have felt about this new level that we're seeing Donald Trump unleash on traditional journalism.
Yeah, I mean, listen, as a lawyer, and it's not just traditional journalism, it's on law firms as well. It's
Well,
on the very
yes, of course.
right. And as a lawyer in law school and just in practice, you're taught to kind of be a zealous advocate for your client, for the issues that you're fighting for. If these cable news shows, these legacy media companies don't fight back and don't have lawyers who are willing to fight back, what does that say for when you're going to need someone to fight for you? It's slowly kind of eroding at the trust of the legal profession, in my opinion. It's slowly eroding at the trust um, of the media apparatus in our country. And I will say it's a very dangerous path that we're on. I tell everyone that Donald Trump 2.0 is so much more dangerous than Donald Trump 1.0 for the simple reason that he's not facing reelection. He has complete immunity for any official acts by the Supreme Court. He doesn't need to win another race in 4 years. He doesn't really care what happens on a day to day, and he's willing to push kind of the bounds of the United States Constitution, the bounds of the law, to see what he can do, how far he really can go. And when you capitulate to that, when you allow him to win in a case that probably is winnable for yourself. I mean, ABC News could have won that case. CBS News can win this case. If they capitulate to him, it just gives him permission to do it again and even worse. And I think that is a dangerous part. Every time someone folds and doesn't fight back, he's emboldened to do more. And we're seeing it time and time again.
And clearly, with the CBS situation, it is a quid pro quo for the
Sure.
Paramount uh, Skydance merger, and it's really all about money and people not wanting to stop this merger, specifically Sherry Redstone. And there used to be such a strong division between these corporations who own these media companies. When I was at NBC, I would never listen to someone at GE who owned us at the time telling me what to do or how to do an interview or criticizing something I did. I mean, I was in a position of power because I was on a very successful show, and I basically told them to pound sand and stay in their lane. I mean, which is not necessarily a position a lot of journalists might find themselves in. So now you have a lot of anticipatory, what is it called? Anticipatory obedience on the part of these journalists who are afraid to come down too hard. And indeed, we've seen uh, ABC News executives telling the people on The View to tone it
Right.
down. We've seen other examples of executives, corporate executives, telling their journalists to take it easy. WNET, I read, took out a part of a documentary where somebody was
I
very
see that.
critical of Donald Trump. Uh, do you think people appreciate how effed up and dangerous this is?
No, I don't. I don't think people, especially people my age, don't realize it because we've never lived through something like this. We a lot of, I guess, like my parents' generation may appreciate it a little more because they're coming from, like, my parents immigrated over from the Soviet Union, right? This was more common in Russia. This isn't common in the United States of America. People my age don't appreciate it, and they won't appreciate it until it impacts them directly. And I think that's a very dangerous part in all of this.
Do you think a lot of Americans don't understand basic civics?
I do, and it's not their fault. I think it's the fault of our education system. I think the fact that we don't have mandatory civics education in every school across the country is a problem. I think that we need a baseline civics curriculum. But the fact of the matter is, we're in a situation now where Oklahoma is forcing its students to learn about election denialism in the 2020 election. And that's to them, that's civics to them. And that is dangerous. So if we don't have that baseline curriculum, it's going to be bad.
I wanted to ask you about a recent tear you went on, Aaron, about Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson's book, accusing them of being part of a coordinated effort to smear Joe Biden. Why don't you think that's a legitimate news story? And, I interviewed Jake and Alex. I've known Jake Tapper for a long time. We're kind of contemporaries. And I'm curious why you didn't think that was a subject worth exploring.
I never said that it wasn't a subject worth exploring. I think it was a subject worth exploring. I think how it's gone about in terms of presenting to the public is the problem. A couple things. Number one, I think if you have all this evidence and you're learning all this information about President Biden's alleged mental decline during the 2024 election, as a journalist, it's your responsibility to release it when you have it and when you vet it. And that's during the election so that the public is aware. That's number one. And a number of facts came out afterwards, I know, but there were a number of facts that they learned of on the campaign trail. So that's number one. I think number two is the way it's being presented now. President Biden is no longer president. He is not the commander in chief. He is not making decisions. You can go and sell your book all you want. I have no issues of Tapper and Thompson doing that. But when you turn CNN into Tapper's book agent every night, and every single interview asks about Tapper's book, that to me is a problem because that seems like CNN is just trying to sell the book of one of their biggest hosts, not necessarily kind of doing honest and like honest journalism. And so that's my biggest critique. And I think that the way it's kind of been presented publicly is this kind of us versus them mentality of like we want to push this narrative that every Democrat running in 2028 needs to answer what they thought about President Biden in 2024 when that's not where we are as a country. That's not what everyday Americans care about. They care about who is in office right now and what the person in office is doing. And if your coverage isn't focused on that, then that's a problem, in my opinion.
Well, I agree with you on a number of points, but just as my personal rebuttal, I think you're right. I think they were obligated to divulge any information they discovered during the campaign. They would say 90% of what we learned that was going on behind the scenes, we learned after he dropped out and after the election. I agree with you wholeheartedly. There was something gross and unseemly about the way Jake was hawking his book every day on his show and holding it up and telling people to buy it and using it as a platform to sell books. I thought was really yucky. I do think that he is aggressively covered Donald Trump. So I don't think it's an either or situation. And I guess finally, many people would argue Joe Biden and his inner circle of enablers. And by the way, I know Joe Biden, I like Joe Biden, but they actually are the reason we have Donald Trump. Because had he dropped out earlier and allowed a primary process to go forward, we would have found the best candidate would have emerged to beat Donald Trump, and leaving Kamala Harris as the heir apparent with only 107 days to campaign was just not an adequate amount of time to introduce her to the American people. And that the judgment he and his inner circle showed got us in this situation where democracy is so much in peril. So that's what I would say to you about that.
I mean, you might be right. Hindsight is obviously 2020, but at the same time, I have my own kind of small rebuttal to that, and that's that
your
my rebuttal.
your move, sir.
Yeah, I mean, listen, my rebuttal to that is Kamala Harris didn't lose this election. Donald Trump won the election, and I truly, personally, I don't know a Democrat that would have beaten Donald Trump in 2024. Whether Biden dropped out 6 months earlier, a year earlier, the political headwinds were so strong against any Democratic nominee, whether it was Vice President Harris or Governor Newsom or Governor Whitmer, and arguably more so strongly against someone who is not Biden or Harris because they're just not as well known to the country.
Yeah, but they would have
Um,
had time to introduce themselves. And I mean, you're right. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. Hindsight is 2020. But there is, I think, a pretty powerful argument to be made that things might have, and we'll never know, turned out differently if Joe Biden had stepped down earlier, as he said during his campaign that he was going to be a bridge to the next generation, flanked by Cory Booker, Gretchen Whitmer, and Kamala Harris. And then he reneged on that.
yeah, and listen, I'm not defending President Biden. I'm not saying that he should have stayed in the race as long as he did. I don't know, and truth be told, maybe it would have been better. But at the end of the day, hindsight is 2020. What happened happened, and now I think it's important to look forward because Democratic Party isn't running against Donald Trump anymore. It's not running against necessarily the MAGA movement. It's going to be running against a completely different form of republicanism come 2028. And I think that the party needs to look forward, not backwards.
Okay. Let me ask you about legacy media because a little bit more, because I know you say you're a news aggregator, that you're not an investigative journalist, and a lot of your videos are regurgitating breaking news headlines, giving them context and perspective, granted, and your
Yeah.
take on them. But isn't the work you do made possible by legacy media and all the reporters out in the field? And don't you have to be careful about disparaging their work too much? Because without them, you wouldn't have a job.
Well, so I'll push back a little bit. About 50 to 60% of the stories that I cover are actually stories that I source myself. It's not necessarily aggregating other breaking news headlines. I have notifications on for every single member of Congress, every single world leader. When Donald Trump posts something on Truth Social, I read it and I report on it. I don't wait for the New York Times to read it, report on it, then report on what the Times said,
Right.
right? I watch C-SPAN religiously. When I see something on C-SPAN, I kind of throw it out there. I get tips to my email inbox daily from federal employees, from sending me memos, sending me information that I cover as well. So that's about half the work. The other half the work is made possible by legacy media for sure,
And
but
by
it's made possible.
investigative reporters who spend weeks, if not months, digging in, filing FOIA requests, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera.
100%. And I would never degrade the work that they're doing, especially the work that local journalists are doing, the ABC affiliates, the NBC affiliates on the ground. And I have talked time and time again about the amazing work that they do and how they need to be uplifted. I think where my gripe with legacy media is I guess maybe framed wrong in the sense of my gripe is with cable news media and the hosts that are on it and the way news is portrayed on television rather than an individual reporter. I think the Washington Post has some brilliant reporters, but I have a problem with the Post as a brand because of the influence that its owner has, right? So I have a problem with kind of the overall media apparatus rather than any individual reporter.
Right. And what is your beef, particularly with cable news? Is it that it's the way information is framed or put in context? And do you have a beef with all cable news, or do you have a beef primarily with Fox News?
So my primary beef comes from CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. Those kind of the big three in a way. Not necessarily like there's some great, like David Muir does great work. Like there's some really good kind of cable news hosts, but I think when I'm watching CNN at the 10 p.m. hour and it's Abby Phillips' show, and Abby is great. I think she's amazing. But when it's a roundtable discussion of politics rather than just giving me what I need to know from the day, that to me upsets me because it's no longer fact-based journalism. It's an opinion talk show host. It's The View, but just at 10 p.m. And I'm not watching CNN at 10 p.m. personally to get opinions from Scott Jennings or from someone on the left. I'm watching CNN at 10 p.m. to get information about what I missed during the day, and I just don't get that anymore.
Yeah. And what about Fox, the way they frame everything? I mean, to me, it's fascinating to watch MSNBC. And by the way, a very small audience is watching all of these
Right.
cable news networks at this point. But I like to see how a story's framed by MSNBC versus Fox. Now, I'm more aligned with the way MSNBC is framing the story. But Fox, I remember when the stock market was crashing, they took down the ticker. You don't
Right.
hear about a lot of things that Donald Trump is doing on Fox News. And if you do, it's framed in a very positive way and not sort of a holistic look at whatever action has been taken.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think I remember when the birthright citizenship executive order was struck down the first time. Instead of talking about that, they were talking about plastic straws for 15 minutes. And I was watching that and I was like, this is just, you're doing a disservice to the people that are watching your channel. Just be honest with what's happening in our country and what the courts are saying and what the president is doing, and let them decide for themselves whether or not they agree with it or not.
Well, their
Like,
motto used to be, "We report, you decide." But I don't think, I always say it's like, we retort, we deride.
yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's bad how they've kind of framed it, and I mean, I don't think at least anymore they pretend to be, at least at night with like the Hannitys of the world and Laura Ingraham. I don't think they pretend to be a news show as much as they pretend to be kind of
They're
an
talk
opinion.
radio on TV, really.
That's really what it is at this point.
Does your family still watch Fox News?
No, they do not. Not from what I'm aware of. I haven't been down there in a little while, but probably not.
Let me ask you a little bit about your process. You post 12 to 15 TikToks a day, Aaron. You post 5 to 6 times a day on Substack. How much time are you spending on social media and following the news every day? And how do you unplug, if ever?
I don't unplug. Work life balance doesn't exist for me. I'm 26 years old. I feel like I can work as much as I can until I start having kids, and then I'll have to slow down a little bit. I am online truthfully all the time, unless it's Friday nights for Shabbat. I try to unplug and kind of be off my phone for several hours if possible. But otherwise, I am monitoring it 24/7. Like I said, I have notifications on for every time a member of Congress tweets. So I wake up to 2,000 notifications every morning that I scroll through
Oh
to
my
see what I'm
God.
like missing. So I'm always online.
I want to ask you about Ukraine because of your family connections there. I mean, there's so many news events I'd like to talk to you about, but let me just run down a few right now. Do you think people understand how strange it is that Donald Trump did a complete about face on behalf of the United States America when it comes to supporting Ukraine versus Vladimir Putin? And how do you, as someone with such close ties, how do you make sense of it?
I don't. I mean, I don't want to speculate, right? Like there are so many people out there speculating that Trump is in Putin's pocket. There was even like a TikTok trend, people talking about how Trump was being a Kremlin agent, and I think all of that's BS. Like I don't buy into the conspiracy theories or the speculation. I think, truth be told, I don't know that this is as much Trump as it is about Vance and those around him and this kind of America first mentality of trying to abandon anyone overseas. It's not just Ukraine, right? We're seeing them pull foreign aid from countries across the world. And America's soft power has been weakened tremendously
Because
since
of
January.
USAID.
Right, exactly. So I don't know that it's just Ukraine. I think Ukraine is just a hot button issue because it's the war where American dollars have been spent on. But I don't know. I don't know how to reconcile it. It's very scary. And maybe, I mean, listen, maybe Trump is coming around to the idea that Putin doesn't want peace. He's been calling Putin crazy lately and
I
saying that he's
know
playing
he's
with
actually
fire.
acting like a petulant, jilted teenager on Truth Social,
Yeah,
talking about Putin now and how disappointed he is and how he's crazy. And but it strikes me as like just reeking of naivete.
it is. I mean, it is. I think really Trump tried to portray himself as someone who could come in as a deal maker and really end this war. And Joe Biden couldn't do it. So Trump is going to do it. And I think with each passing day, he gets more and more frustrated that he's realizing, hey, one side to this doesn't actually want to end the war.
And maybe foreign policy is a little more complicated than he thought.
Maybe, maybe.
Let me ask you about the big, beautiful bill.
Yes.
You know, I know that I believe you or somebody, I read so much too, Aaron, I kind of get mixed up at some point, but someone said, I think maybe you did, how it was going to basically turbocharge income inequality in this country,
Yeah.
exacerbate it as never before. Maybe that was someone else. Was that you, Aaron?
I may have said something.
Anyway, do you think people understand truly what is in this bill and how it will impact the least fortunate Americans?
No, not at all. I mean, and I think the reason why is because the messaging just isn't there. I mean, I could say the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 10% will suffer the most and the top 10% will suffer the least or will benefit the most. But ultimately, this bill is hundreds of pages in length. Your average American is not reading it. Your average American doesn't know that on page 562, there's a paragraph that limits a federal court's ability to enforce contempt proceedings against the administration, right? Like the average American doesn't really understand what Medicaid cuts mean, what requirements for Medicaid are, and how that can be implemented in states around the country. So it really won't, the impacts of it won't be felt truthfully for a while, for several years. And maybe that's what they want, because by that point, if you look at the bill, many of the cuts and the work requirements don't start until after the midterm election. So the impacts really won't be felt for a lot of people until 2027. And by then, Republicans could run on the fact that they just cut a bunch of taxes and look, Medicaid's still fine, everything's fine. And then January 1st, 2027 comes around and 13.7 million Americans are without health care. So
What do you think of the fact that RFK Jr. and HHS and the CDC and basically are saying that pregnant women and children no longer need to get the COVID vaccine? I mean, that has been so politicized, and you know, medical news was never politicized in this way.
it's unfortunate. I mean, here's the thing. If that is what doctors believe and if that's what the research suggests, then great, go forward with it and remove it off the immunization schedule for pregnant women and healthy children. But it's gotten to the point where anything RFK Jr. says is distrusted by a majority of the American public because of the things that he had said in the past about this vaccine. So it's an unfortunate situation where medical decisions are now politicized, where the Secretary of Health and Human Services, if you ask the average American who was the HHS secretary under Biden or under Obama or even under Trump 1, no one would know. Maybe 1% of 1% would know. A lot of people know who RFK Jr. is, and that's a problem.
Aaron, how do you book guests? Because you recently nabbed an interview with Cory Booker after his 25-hour filibuster. Do you just reach out to their teams? Do they know who you are? I'm lucky because I've been doing this for a long time, a lot longer than you have. And so I was able to, establish a name for myself before the media landscape was so fragmented. But for you, you're relatively new to the game. How hard is it for you to secure these interviews with people like Cory Booker?
It's hard, but I really hustle. I mean, I DM people, I cold email them, I cold text them. I try to get information wherever I can, people's contact information. And I just kind of I bug them incessantly until they say yes.
And I'm
So, but
sure now that they know about your reach, the fact that you are the number one news and politics Substack in the world, and I've just joined Substack, so we'll have to do some conversations like that on that platform. But, um, they must be like, oh yeah, I know Aaron Parnes. I'd be happy to talk to him. And you're reaching this audience of much younger voters who are really turned off by a lot of other news sources.
yeah, for sure. And I think it's gotten to the point where like I now have a personal relationship with like Senator Booker. Like you build relationships with not just their staff, but the member themselves as well. When you speak to them on numerous occasions and you talk to them off the record and on the record, and you kind of just develop those relationships. And it's been great. I mean, now I get messages every day from members wanting to come on.
Oh, well, they're calling you instead of you reaching
Right.
out to them. That's a
Right.
very enviable place to be. Um, I was going to ask you something and then it just flew out of my head because you told me they were calling you instead of you calling them. Oh, I wanted to know, how do you make money, Aaron? Because you don't charge for any of your content. And my parents always told me it was impolite to discuss money with people. But how do you earn a living, Aaron?
So I don't charge for any of the content, but I earn a full-time living from people who just want to become paid subscribers and support the work, even though it's all free. So make a complete full-time living on Substack, and also the like TikTok, YouTube, the platforms themselves pay out through creativity funds that they built out for creators. So they pay out through that as well, and that's kind of how I make a living. But people are willing to pay for even free news because they support me and the work that I'm doing.
It seems to me that there's been a lot of conversation about right wing media and how powerful it was or it is. I interviewed Michael Tomasky. He's the editor of the New Republic, and he wrote in a piece, quote, "Once upon a time, the mainstream media was a beach ball and the right wing media was a golf ball. Today, the mainstream media is the size of a volleyball and the right wing media is the size of a basketball, which, in case you're wondering, is bigger." 2024 was the year in which it became obvious that the right wing media has more power than the mainstream media. It's not just that it's bigger, it's that it speaks with one voice. And that voice says Democrats and liberals are treasonous elitists who hate you, and Republicans and conservatives love God and country and are your last line of defense against your son coming home from school as your daughter. Why do you think the right wing media has been so effective? And do you see this surge of media on the other side that is starting slowly but surely to counter some of the messaging right wing media is spewing on a regular daily, if not minute by minute basis?
Well, I think to the first point is because they got it right. Like they know how to they know how to play the game, right? So you'll have someone will put out a tweet saying that Mr. Potato Head is actually transgender. That'll be the tweet that comes out. It'll get blown up on Twitter because Elon Musk quote tweets it. Then Will Chamberlain on Fox News will feature it during the day. Then Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity will talk about it at night. Then it'll be on Ben Shapiro's podcast and Megyn Kelly's podcast the next day. They will talk about the same talking point across whether you are one follower or 10 million followers, and they'll beat it as much as they can.
Do they
They're
have this big editorial god who's sending them like talking points every day?
maybe,
Because Roger Ailes used to do that at Fox News, and they
I mean,
probably still do.
probably. I mean, but they are so coordinated when it comes to messaging. If they want to talk about Hunter Biden's laptop, that's all you'll hear for days from everyone. And I think that's where they get it right. As far as whether it's kind of building on the left, it is and it isn't, right? I think that there are definitely media kind of companies and media personalities like Midas Touch, for example, that are really doing great work on the left and they are building something really big there. But outside of them, I think where the left gets it wrong is that they're just looking to replicate what the right does. But you can't do that because the messaging isn't the same. Because on the left, if you say talk about reproductive rights, and everyone talks about reproductive rights, you're not going to get everyone to talk about that. Someone's going to talk about climate, someone's going to talk about small businesses, someone's going to talk about like criminal justice. You're going to be all over the place. And until you fix messaging, it doesn't matter whether you have 100 million followers or a million followers or one follower. You're just not going to get anything across. So they are building. I just think that they may be building it wrong.
Building it wrong because they are not sticking to one message.
Because
Um,
it's about messaging because they don't have a good message, not necessarily sticking to one message. They don't have a good message that resonates with voters right now, number
So,
one.
what
But
should their message be?
I I don't know. I mean, I am not in the position
Yeah,
make that decision.
that's
Truthfully,
above your pay grade. Well, we don't know that, but
it is above my pay grade. And I think that where I tell everyone 2024 was not a bloodbath. It was not an election landslide the way some on the right have painted it out to be. It was 210,000 votes in three swing states. That was the election. And ultimately, it could, if the election were held a month later, it could have swung. If the election were held 2 months earlier, it could have swung. I don't know. And I think to say that there is such a disparity between the right and the left right now in America, it's not fully accurate. It just is an opinion.
there's sort of this massive swath of people in the middle, too.
There and there
Um,
and there are a lot of
some
people, young people, who the left needs to get better at talking to.
and also people need to help them understand the issues. Someone wrote in, I know the rage gets clicks, but I'd like to see the Dems move forward with the plan. Um, we're talking about sort of progressive media, but what about the Democratic Party in general? I mean, I know you're not a Democratic strategist, and I think it's important to delineate what you do and what sort of people who
Yeah.
are coming up with talking points and sort of the ethos and the future ethos of the Democratic Party. But what would you like to see more of come from Democrats and not just the people covering them?
Well, I'd like there to be a leader, right? Like, I'd like the Democrats to find a leader to unify around. That's number one. And whether that's someone like Pete Buttigieg or Hakeem Jeffries, whoever it is, I'd like to them to find someone who has that voice that speaks for the party. Because I don't think the DNC should ever be speaking for the party. It's more of just kind of inner party minutia that they decide. So I think the Democratic Party needs a leader, number one. And then number two, I think once they have a leader, what I would like to see is just like coordinated messaging on a few main issues. We shouldn't be hitting Donald Trump on everything he does because he does so much stuff that if you're just hitting him on everything, you're never gonna be able to put forth your own message on things. And so I think we need to find coordinated messaging on key issues, whether it be immigration reform, reproductive justice, whatever it is. I mean, figure out what polls will, I don't care. And just start hitting those and put forth your own agenda rather than just this we don't like Trump agenda.
Well, it's interesting because I do see a lot more Democrats showing up on social media, talking straight to camera, telling people what's going on. But it seems to me there should be somebody who says, okay, everybody today on social media, let's focus on this. So, in aggregate, they could communicate their message and really get it across. Before we go, I wanted to ask you about the NPR lawsuit
Yeah.
against Donald Trump and everything that, good Lord, is happening at Harvard. As a lawyer, how do you see all of this kind of shaking out? And do you think the judiciary is going to stand up for NPR and Harvard? And if they do you think it will have any impact on what the administration does? Because so far, they don't seem to be paying a lot of attention to judges.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I really do trust our judiciary. I clerked for a federal judge who was confirmed 100-0 back when federal judges were confirmed unanimously. And I saw the judiciary from the inside out. I really do have a lot of faith in the judicial process. It's slow. It's um, mainly focused on gridlock, really, and obstruction within. But that's mainly what the system is meant to do and meant to be. And it protects the American people. And I think when it comes to NPR, when it comes to Harvard, when it comes to these lawsuits, I think the judiciary will rule in accordance with the law. And yeah, well, Trump will win on some grounds in some cases. I'm not saying he's going to lose every single case, but they will uphold the law. And I think that's ultimately what needs to happen. Whether Trump is right or whether he is wrong, the law needs to be upheld. And if they uphold the law and Trump chooses not to follow the law and play fast and loose with the law, then I think where the new judiciary needs to go is it needs to be more explicit. Donald Trump, with this whole Kilmar Abrego Garcia Supreme Court debacle, the Supreme Court said you need to facilitate his return. They never said you need to get Kilmar back. They were very intentionally vague in the word choice of facilitate, because facilitate can mean a number of things. And Trump is now saying, you know what, I am facilitating it. I am maybe we ask behind the scenes the government of El Salvador to bring him back or whatever.
And they're
Um,
refusing,
and there was
yeah.
exactly that, but that is facilitating in his mind. And by being intentionally vague, the last thing judges want to do is make precedent. I've learned that. And so they are intentionally vague to kind of allow for these legal maneuvers. And I think the judiciary needs to become more explicit in its rulings to prevent what happened with Kilmore Abrego Garcia from happening to NPR or Harvard or any of these other institutions.
Well, Aaron Parnes, I have kept you over an hour and you've got a lot of news to cover, so I'm going to let you go. It's such a pleasure to meet you, Aaron. I really appreciate your time and keep up the good work. And thank you so, so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much for having me. This was amazing.